I want to show you something. And that is that I not only read your book, but do you see the dog-eared?
Yes.
Okay, and I've got a lot of quotes I want to read and get to while we talk. But first of all, before I introduce you properly, thank you for writing a really good book. I finished it this morning and I've got a lot of passages marked to talk with you, and it's really first rate.
Oh, thank you so much for reading it and taking that time. It really means a lot.
Yeah, you know what I didn't check was the pub date. When is this out or coming out, or has it been out, or what's going on?
It came out on April 30th.
Okay, good. Well, let me introduce you properly and then we will get into talking about this remarkable book. All right. So my name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is a writer and editor, and her name is Cait West. And Cait has written a terrific book, and we're going to be talking about it today. And it is called, rather than reading from my notes, I'll read from the cover, Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And we were introduced, as it were, through someone we've introduced to our listeners a while back, and that's Sarah Stankorb, who wrote a book that we talked with her about. And Cait, we asked her, we always ask our guests, do you recommend somebody we would be able to talk to? And Sarah very kindly passed on your name. So thank you for that, Sarah. So let's talk about the book. Cait serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse, and co-hosts the podcast Survivors Discuss. Cait is the author of Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy, and we will be talking about that today. And as I said, Cait was referred to us by our friend Sarah Stankorb, author of Disobedient Women. And we have had a good time talking with a number of people who, like me, come from evangelical backgrounds and who have written memoir type books about that exodus. And I guess your book, Rift, is a book like that. It falls into that category. It's very personal. And I'm going to start, before I ask you a question, I'm going to just give people the flavor of the book a little bit. I've got quotes throughout the book. I think I have 17 places marked that I want to talk about. But I'm going to read something from page 3. I have long attempted to find the words to accurately describe what happened to me. And the short version is always too short. I was born into a strict religious family, homeschooled, and ruled by authoritarian discipline and a literal interpretation of the Bible. We eventually stumbled into the Christian patriarchy movement, but I was told it was God's plan all along. That's how you begin your book, or those are in the early pages of the book. So I'm going to ask you a question today. I think, there'd be two ways I could do this interview. One would be to talk about your story, but you tell that better than I could repeat it. So what I've done is rather mark passages that kind of, in a weird way, overlap with my own journey and talk about things that I understand from the inside as someone who had a very similar experience in a very different way, but similar. So what I'm going to want you to do is to also talk about your journey, and we'll start with that. We'll start with the journey. Give me a thumbnail sketch of the book, and then I'm going to jump into the specifics of what I want to talk about. So that may seem odd, but I think it'll work well for this book because your journey is very powerful. And I want you to kind of take us through what the book is about. I don't mean the intellectual content that we're going to be talking about. I mean your personal story. Tell us your story. Tell us the story that is so beautifully articulated in the book, and people should read it. And that is the framework that we can come back to when discussing the content I want to dive into. Okay, that's the longest I'm going to talk in this interview.
Okay, that sounds good. So yes, that passage you read is the beginning of my story where I was born and then baptized into a Presbyterian family. in Delaware is where we lived at the time. And the book covers from then on until my early 30s. And it covers how my family became more and more radicalized, in my opinion, inside of the Christian patriarchy movement. People might be familiar with Bill Gothard and IBLP or Doug Phillips and Vision Forum. That was the world I grew up in. And what that meant was fathers are in charge of their home, and really men are in charge of everything in society, and then women are to submit to the men. And for me, being a kid and especially a girl, I grew up being told that my purpose in life would be to get married and have as many children as possible. And what that meant for me was when I turned 18, instead of going to college or figuring out my own life, I was kept home until my father was going to find me a husband. And that's why girls like me were called stay-at-home daughters.
Yeah.
Because I stayed home well into my 20s before I figured a way to leave. And so the story is of me being a part of that world, trying to conform, trying to submit, and not making it work. And then realizing I needed to leave and how I left, and then what it was like on the other side. And that's kind of the idea of a rift, of, a rift in relationship, the rift within yourself, but also this idea that you can never completely leave your past.
Mm.
And I've had to go back and visit it in order to heal on this side of things.
Yeah, and that's part of the story you tell, is the kind of revisiting of that past and trying to come to terms with it with your family and how they reacted to your leaving and so forth. Let me read another thing here. This is from page 13, going in order here. I was good at following the rules, and I was quick to judge the neighbors for their heathen behavior, like celebrating Halloween and believing in the Easter Bunny. And that begins a discussion that I relate to very much. And that was that when I was raised by Francis and Edith Schaeffer in a evangelical community called L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland back in the 50s and 60s, one of the pressures that I find looking back that really shaped me and I still live with now, and I just had my 72nd birthday. So you have that to look forward to if you make it to 72. But one thing you have to look forward to, at least in my experience, is that one thing I have never gotten over is seeing myself as an individual as weirdly apart from common experience with other people. I still feel myself to be an outsider in any situation. And other people would not understand that. I don't relate to people that way. I probably don't seem that way. But, from my mother's knee, I was taught, we've been chosen to bring these lost people to Christ. We are different. Don't believe anything they are telling you, whether it's about evolution or, in your case, the place of women in society. And although I have rejected that, I still find myself looking at the world around me from the point of view of trying to analyze it, how it relates to what I believe, rather than fitting in some way. So I want to go there in your experience. Does that ring any sort of a bell with you, or is that just my problem?
No, that's such an interesting question because, you know, I think especially the way I grew up was very intellectualized and not embodied at all. And so everything had to do about what we believed and how we interacted with other people to save them. And I still find myself trying to intellectualize everything that I experience instead of just participating in the world around me. Yeah, I definitely still feel in some ways an outsider, but in different ways than I used to be. So that's just an interesting thing I need to think more about.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm talking about is that you can't get inside other people's heads, but I
Mhm.
don't think that most of the people I know have this other conversation in their head of like, how do they fit in with what I believe? They're just sort of more ready to take things as it is. Now, of course, we live in a very divided culture between MAGA and the Trumpers and everyone else, but I was raised to already be there, if you want to put it that way, to see myself as different and set apart and analyze other people of, are they doing what we do? Do they
Mm.
believe what we believe? That's what I'm talking about. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like you talked about the passage about Halloween and just how we had to be different and how
Yeah.
to always angle ourselves in opposition to other people in order to save them or to show that we are more godly than them. I always felt like misunderstood. And I remember talking to kids in my neighborhood about evolution in their class, that they were being taught. And I was like, how
Mm.
could you believe that? And feeling so self-righteous that I would even have that conversation when I was like 8 years old.
Yeah.
Um, but it didn't set me up for healthy social relationships. I didn't really
No.
have close friends as a little kid.
Yeah. And I always felt in the days when I was still very much in the evangelical environment, I think in one of my books, I put it that somehow close to this, and that is that, my kind of unspoken desire was always to be normal and kind of invisible rather than be the person handing out literature on a train or a bus to people. My mother used to do that, hand out tracts, or any conversation you had was completely false. Because if you talk to someone on a train or an airplane or a bus, they thought they were in a conversation with the passenger sitting next to them. You were on an evangelistic mission to change their mind and make them like you. And you had to slip that in at some point. And so years later, I looked back and thought to myself, we didn't actually care about any of those people. What we cared about was the propaganda and finding a way to slip that in. Did you find that pressure in your own journey?
Yeah, definitely. And I was taught, how to talk to other people and how to bring these things up. And I just really struggled to even do it because I was very introverted and it felt wrong in some sense to
Yeah.
just try to convince something of what my parents believed when I wasn't sure I believed it.
Mm.
Because I struggled with doubt most of my life about the religion I was being taught. And so just being evangelistic was difficult for me. And
Yeah.
when I got older and people were asking me about why I lived with my parents, at my age, and I would just tell them what I had been told. Like, this is what God wants me to do. This is my calling in life. And that, in its sense, I was told this was evangelism too, was my lifestyle as a stay-at-home daughter. And that felt very uncomfortable to me because it didn't feel like a choice. Even though I was saying it was, it didn't feel like a true choice because I had no other options.
Yeah, one thing I'll bring up that is sort of relates to your entire story is that I think it would amaze many of the people who are watching or listening to you now that what you went through as a child is somehow even legal in the same way that it amazes people to suddenly hear some horror story about a child who's denied medical care. They pray over her, she dies. Simple antibiotics would have saved her. How can this be? That didn't happen to you, but the idea of a whole generation of young women being raised inside a homeschooling cloister in which all their legal rights are taken away because this is even after you're 18 and somehow you're not introduced to the idea that you're an individual with those rights. Just address that for a minute before we get back into the book. I mean, how does that strike you that in this country of ours we have this evangelical conservative subculture that literally raises their daughters more similarly to the Taliban in Afghanistan than to anything normal American families are subject to? And I don't think that's a stretch. I think that it is true. And right in front of you, and it's not only Christians, you have Hasidic Jewish communities in New York City, of all places, the center of the world, where girls aren't educated and can't speak English and they're married off at 14. I mean, this is not just a Christian thing. This is a religious patriarchal thing that cross
Mhm.
Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But we're talking to you and you were raised in that. So just address that a minute, this sort of weirdness of living in a culture that has all these constitutional rights, unless you're in a religious home and suddenly religious rights are put ahead of everything, just regular children, the civil rights we all take for granted somehow don't exist in these cloistered homeschooled communities. I mean, that's the experience you relate in the book. What do you think about that as a grown up now, as it were, outside of your house?
Yeah, I mean, I was told I was going to be a kid until I got married. And so, yeah, I didn't understand that I was a legal adult or that I had choices. And I know a lot
Yeah,
of girls who didn't have birth certificates or social security cards, or access to their own bank accounts. So
yeah,
there's a lot of abuse happening in these communities. But leaving and discovering the legal aspect of that and how children's rights have been diminished because of the homeschooling community. So,
mm,
an organization called HSLDA, which is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I can't remember if my parents were paying members of this, but it was a big part of our world was this organization that fought for parental rights.
yeah,
And they worked to change laws and to emphasize the law on the parent's side, which really left all of us children vulnerable to abuse of all kinds
yeah,
because there are almost no regulations on homeschooling, um, the homeschooling way of education in the US to this day.
yeah,
Almost all states, you can have a sex offender homeschooling a kid. Um, but I think it goes back even further. I've been learning about playing communities, and there was a case, I believe in the 70s in the Amish community where they fought to have the legal right to stop educating their kids after the eighth grade. And so I think that might be a precedent for what happened in the 80s and 90s with Christian evangelical communities, trying with the homeschooling laws. And so we need to reverse some of those things. And I really think whatever form of education parents want to do, there needs to be boundaries and regulations for the kids' sake, because no matter what the parents believe, all
yeah,
children deserve to be safe.
yeah. And and I have to put it in a political context, which is too bad. But the fact of the matter is, right now we're in an election season, and if Trump is reelected, part of the project of both the Supreme Court that he appointed the majority is to streamline religious rights, as it were, religious liberty rights, which would cover the rights of homeschool parents as opposed to the kids. So whatever the situation is now, if Trump is reelected, will get 10 times worse because the heritage people with Project 2025, besides wanting to take away contraceptives from women, which is the next step in their program, having succeeded on abortion, they are very much on the side that religious rights are more equal than other rights. And so whatever's going on now, it's moving in the other direction in this culture anyway with the MAGA movement. And then if on top of that we got another Trump presidency, the door would be slammed for decades on any hope of protecting those kids. Sorry to make a little speech. I need to just reintroduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is writer and editor Cait West, and Cait is the author of a book that we're talking about called Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And as I showed Cait at the beginning, it's well dog-eared because I've read this with great interest and I really love the book. I want to read something else from it. I hadn't given much thought to how I would end up a wife and mother until my father read me an article in The Patriarch by John Thompson called God's Design for Scriptural Romance. Thompson answered the question, what is God's step-by-step process for bringing about marriage the biblical way, with very detailed instructions on a father-controlled courtship process. He had, quote, 5 fundamental principles of scriptural romance: piety, patriarchy, purity, preparedness, and patience, and a 4-stage process for getting married: friendship, courtship, betrothal, and a wedding. Talk about that a little bit, because again, for someone not familiar with this world, it almost sounds like science fiction that you'd have that kind of laid out, and that thousands and thousands and thousands of kids were raised in this, and many, many thousands more still are in that environment where the father marries them off, much as a Saudi prince would find a child bride for his son. And we say, well, that's part of their culture. We got that right here under our noses in the US, and no one seems to care about the women caught in these situations but you and a few other authors who have been writing about it. So again, this isn't science fiction for anybody listening. This is the real deal. And Cait's book is an incredibly written, beautiful story about this. And by the way, we want to make it part of our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, and we want this to be, I forget what month Ernie said, but I think maybe before November, but we want to include this with your permission if we might.
Yeah,
But
that'd be
anyway,
great.
just talk about that process. We use the word patriarchy, and in the secular context, it means something different. It's just, diversity and equity at the office, and women aren't treated right in the workplace. That's a different sort of an issue. I don't think people understand what you're talking about, that there are girls raised from birth, groomed to obey fathers, even up into the point of if they ever get married themselves and who they marry and what their expectations are. Lay that out a little bit. I mean, your story in your book does, but I want you to just explain this to people who really won't understand what I'm talking about.
Sure. And there's, I think if you dig further back in history, there is a similarity between like secular patriarchy and Christian patriarchy. But I'm in the book, I'm talking about that specific movement in the 90s and early 2000s that continues today, where patriarchy in churches is becoming this paramount idea. And it happens in a lot of different kinds of churches. So it's not specific to one denomination. But this idea of girls being their only purpose to become married and to have children is pretty widespread. I think my family took it very literally, and a lot of people say my experience is extreme, but I do see it in a lot of different churches, especially with purity culture, which, if we dig down into purity culture, that's really rape culture, where you're stripping away women's agency over their bodies.
Yeah.
And so when, stepping away from this movement and understanding that I was being set up for potentially arranged marriage, for marital rape, for no consent, it's terrifying because this has happened to many. I happened to find a way to escape before that happened to me. Um, but, the reason I keep talking about it is because this keeps happening.
Yeah.
And I think we can look to some other countries, like I believe it's Australia that passed a forced marriage ban. And I think we could look to that in the US with banning child marriage, first of all, and then also banning forced marriage, which it might be tricky to figure that out, but I think we could achieve that one day. And I think that would help because this does happen.
Hmm. Well, one thing that has to happen is a cultural shift away from the idea that somehow men are in charge of women, period. I
Hmm.
mean, not put too fine a point on it. And then the other thing that has to happen is, again, and I think this goes back to the present structure of the Supreme Court and the federal court system, and that is we really need to refuse to allow religious liberty issues to trump every other right, because then all people are not created equal. Some are more equal than others, and that is,
Hmm.
you know, and in our present situation, it means that people who are a very conservative right-wing bent have a right to do things to people in the environment of religion in church or the family, which in any other environment would put them in prison.
Right.
But if, as long as it's
Exactly.
done in the name of this is what I believe, this is my faith, and I have rights, this is our religion, we're doing this in church, and we had a small illustration of that during COVID, where you had churches become the epicenter of the spread of the COVID illness in thousands of people because they just point blank refused to listen to health authorities. And because, they said, well, this is a religious liberty issue, it's not a public health issue. Well, we're looking at the same thing here. Let me just talk about something here moving on a little bit, picking up on what you're saying. On page 45, I've heard us called the Joshua generation, the children of the patriarchy, the children of those who are returning to God and returning to the way families were created to be. Our parents were raised in the outside world, and so we'll never see the full harvest of their choices, but we were supposed to. We were supposed to be raised in the true doctrines of the faith, trained in our proper gender roles, shaped into soldiers for the coming kingdom. I thought first of all, that's an incredibly articulated passage. You're such a good writer. And secondly, let's talk about that idea that somehow this was a prophetic generation. They weren't going to see the fulfillment of their trek into the promised land, but you all who were being raised as their stay-at-home daughters were supposed to complete the circle and do what they hadn't been able, because they were raised in this unbelieving world and wounded by it, but you were going to have this perfect life because your dad would pick a husband for you and you were going to live this godly motherhood agenda. So talk a little bit about that aspect of it, just that whole vision of the world that you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I heard that throughout my especially teenage years. I think it was Mike Ferris from HSLDA who coined that term, the Joshua generation, and then they even have an organization called Generation Joshua. Or I always switch them. Sometimes I get them flipped, but there is still an organization called that, and it's raising young people to believe that they have to have these dominionist ideas of taking over government, of infiltrating culture, of perpetuating their specific version of Christianity into the world. And so
Yeah.
growing up that way, you know, you're told that it's a special calling, right? So like that's appealing, especially when you're young and you're idealistic, and you want the world to be a better place. I think it preys on those feelings of young people. Um, People my age were sent to like debate camp to learn how to debate, organizations like Teen Pact to raise Christian leaders. I wasn't sent to any of those because I lived pretty isolated, but I knew people who were trained to be political in that way. And it's interesting now because I heard recently that one of the lawyers who helped out with the Dobbs case, which overthrew Roe v. Wade, grew up in the Vision Forum world like I did, and is around
Yeah.
my age. And he's very proud of the fact that he helped overthrow Roe. And for me, it's devastating, you know, that my generation has contributed to that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to see us diverge. I mean, obviously he's a man and I'm a woman, and so it impacts us differently. But, you know, we were trained to do that, and some of us are fulfilling that purpose.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because, of course, Amy Coney Barrett was raised in a very patriarchal subgroup of the Roman Catholic Church that was
Mhm.
co-Protestant run. And their whole thing was a patriarchal vision of life and also a sort of a non contraceptive view of marriage, lots of children, and this whole package. And she carried that into the Supreme Court, and she was groomed for a leadership position by various groups, Heritage and other far right groups who picked up on smart, young, bright, indoctrinated young men and women coming out of these movements, very
Mhm.
much like yours, who stuck with the program and now sit on the federal bench.
Yeah.
I mean, and this was not coincidental. Um, Let me just do a little reintroduction of my show here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm Frank Schaeffer. I'm talking to Cait. And please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we will have your book as a It Has to Be Read offering in September. That's when we're going to do it. And hopefully we can get you back and have you on a panel with some other women who have written about these subjects, because you're not the only person who's gone through it. Let me get back to something in the book here for a minute. You write on page 63, we were called stay-at-home daughters. We had scrapbooking birthday parties. We sent each other handwritten letters, trading stickers when we were young, copying poetry as we grew older. The highlight of our year was the Civil War ball put on by the homeschooling community. We spent months sewing lace and satin gowns. We wanted to feel beautiful, feminine, like Meg in Little Women. Lovely passage again. You write beautifully. I mean, this all feels like descriptions out of a really wonderful novel. Um, Such a good writer.
Thank you.
But anyway, to get into the content of that for a minute, I think that sums up so well this apartness, other girls are doing other things. You're preparing for this thing. It's a big event. Um, did you miss the connections when you were younger with what you might have thought of as the outside or the secular world? Did you long for those? Did you feel guilty about it? At what age did pendulum swing and the balance tip when all of a sudden it's like, not only do I, the sense of zeal of being a mission to this world changed to like, man, I would like to do more than prepare for the Civil War ball. There's a big, beautiful world out there. Maybe I could go to a movie sometime or date someone that my father hasn't set me up with. When maybe age wise, and what were the steps that led you to that next kind of self-examination and sense of unease in which you were stuck in? When did you start planning to escape?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, first off, before I was homeschooled, I went to a private Christian school for a few months before my parents decided to switch to homeschooling. So I got a small taste of being with other kids my age. And I was always really sad because it was kindergarten, and I knew that once you hit first grade, you got your own lunchbox. So I would fantasize about little things like that as a kid, like, oh, if I went to school, I would have a lunchbox, and maybe I would have friends I could see every day. So as I was little, I would have those secret dreams, and they just evolved as I got older. But I always repressed them because I thought I have to obey my father, which is obeying God. Um, as I became a teenager, I was really invested in learning to play the piano and, really wanted to pursue that as a potential career. But again, career was not something I was allowed to have. And so I just repressed that and was told like my highest calling for playing piano would be playing at church. So I played at church. Um, all these things built up, over the years. And I didn't thinking about leaving until after I had my first courtship because um it didn't go very like it was a very long relationship. My father was in complete control, and then my father ended the relationship. And I was
Why
heartbroken.
did he do that?
So there's different reasons. It's hard to explain because my father can make up arbitrary reasons to control things. I think the ultimate reason was control. There were things like this person didn't have a steady job for more than a few months at a time, which, is a valid reason to before you get married to somebody, maybe to consider. But things like that. He wasn't quite the person my father thought was the right one for me, even though I felt like I loved this person.
Can you paint the scene on the day he ended it and how you're feeling? And what, again, this is so far-fetched for people. You're in a relationship your dad set up. How did he break the news it's over? Where were you standing when he told you or sitting? Just describe that vignette.
Yeah, so I remember the last day I had with this person, and I used the name Will in the book to describe him because I use pseudonyms. And I remember we had this one last day before my dad was going to break the news. I don't remember one time my dad saying to me that it was over because it was over many times of him saying, I don't think this is the right one. I don't think this is the right one. So when he finally cut it off, we had one last quiet day, and then I said goodbye. And then my father followed him out to his car and told him.
Was
And
he a homeschool boy as well?
I think he was, yeah. He was a little bit older than me, and we hadn't grown up together. But I'm pretty sure he was homeschooled or at least went to Christian school. And he told us separately, and so we never had a joint conversation about that. And then later, I was so devastated. My father, he called a meeting in the living room, me and my mom, and him, and he laid out for me what I needed to do to get right with God because he said this relationship had been a mistake, that I had let my heart get carried away, that my love for this person was essentially cheating on my future spouse. And so I had to repent for that because God's wrath would be on me if I didn't repent for that. And I remember that very clearly because it was one of the times when I felt very much dissociating, like disembodied. And it was a very traumatic moment for me. Um,
How old were you?
I was 21.
And where was your mother, in the room?
She was there sitting quietly,
Did she
listening.
ever say anything, speak up, say maybe, did she ever intimate to you that maybe if it was up to her, it would be different, but after all, men are in charge, and so we have to do what he says?
I'm not sure if she would have articulated that with words. I got that feeling from her without words. Uh, but at that time, and I think later on she would say that, but at that time she was um, going along with what my dad wanted.
Yeah.
And so I just remember that also as a moment where my intuition woke up and this, what my dad would call rebellion, what I would call fire, came alive. And I realized I don't want this anymore. I don't want my father to pick my husband. And all I knew was I was never going to let that happen to me. I didn't know the details. And so I didn't leave until when I was 25, 4 years later, but that was the start of me thinking about it. Um, that cognitive dissonance really broke for me.
I'm so glad that you take the time to describe this in your book so well. And then in addition to which, just share that with us, because again, I think this is just such a foreign landscape, but I don't want to, oversay this here, but I can remember one time being in Heathrow in London, stuck in a lounge and striking up a conversation with a very articulate, educated, gorgeous Saudi young woman. Probably I'd say she was in her mid-20s, and her flight was late and mine was too. And she was flying on Saudi Arabian Airlines back to Saudi, and I was on my way back to the US. And with a big sigh, she said, "I'm sorry, I have to get ready for the flight." And she disappeared and took her bag with her. And when she came back, she was in the full head covering. Her face was covered, everything. And she says, "I have to get on the airplane as a Saudi princess."
Mhm.
And she had tears in her eyes. I can remember, it really got to me. I mean, it just evoked looking through a fence at Jewish children in Auschwitz, and you're free on the outside, and she's stuck in this world. And I got on my flight back to the States, so grateful to for my daughters and my granddaughters, and so angry. And it just hearing you talk about this, I find your book so moving, and I'm so angry.
Oh,
Um,
that's
you
really
know,
validating, and thank you for sharing that story. And I think it really helps that you've shared a story like that because so many times people will tell me you could have just left or you could have left earlier. Um, but these kinds of situations, especially if it's the culture of your family, it's not so easy to just walk away, especially
no,
when you have finances, you don't have resources. There's a lot of abuse happening, coercive control, like who knows what she was experiencing, to feel like she had to go back. So thanks for sharing that because sometimes people just don't believe the stories.
well, and often people don't understand that you were raised in this. And I love that you bring up the finances. Like, what else do you know how to do?
Right.
You've been kept away from any possibility. This is your whole world. I mean, people just certainly don't understand it. And certainly legislators don't understand this when they allow the courts to allow this sort of stuff to keep going. On page 123, you say, "I didn't know what to do when I found out that spiritual abuse was using God and the Bible to control someone, that my father had shamed me into submission by telling me I was sinful if I made decisions for myself. The words from the commandment, quote, 'Children, obey your parents,' end quote, that once anchored me in static passivity," again, just you read so well, "now meant nothing. I was no longer a child." I love that. But, since I've allowed myself to get emotional telling somebody else's story, I just have to tell you something. Okay. And this is not, we're not wrapping this up, even though this will sound like it, but I came away from this book so admiring you, one human to another, and your courage, but also just your fortitude, because the book tells the story not only of your escape, but then later travails with everything from fertility to all sorts of issues. And, I know this is odd for a podcaster to say, but I like you so much. You really touch me through your book. I like you so much. And if I could just reach back and pull you out of there, and as a rebellious person myself trying to leave, say, come on, Cait, let's get the hell out of here. I would do it, but I don't have a time machine. I'm sorry.
Yeah, if
But
we only could go back.
you're a brave person, and I really like you.
Oh, thank
I don't know.
you.
That's not much of a question, but that's an odd way to say something on a podcast. But your book really moved me.
Oh, thank you.
You're a brave, good person. I
I
hope
don't
good
know
things
about
will.
that, but
No, you
it
are.
felt like I needed to tell the story,
Yeah.
it
Well,
felt like I had
you
to.
told an incredible story. I want to go to another thing I want to quote here, and then keep going. And I won't do any more emotional outbursts. But I'll just tell you this: if you read this book and don't feel emotionally responsive to it, you are a sociopath. I say that to my readers. It's a good diagnosis.
A good
I have a
test.
new definition of sociopathy. You read Cait's book, Rift, a memoir breaking away from Christian patriarchy. If this doesn't put tears on your cheeks, you're a sociopath. You'd have it from me. Sorry. Don't want to be judgmental, but you are. Um, the truth is, patriarchy forces conformity. It relies on hierarchy and oppression to survive. The men at the top benefit, and everyone else is left trying to get close to power. Boy, that's brilliant. And that line of yours, everyone else is left getting close to power, doesn't that explain the complicity of so many women who are in the
Yeah.
movement and won't get out, but try to somehow get close to power through the men? The
Hmm.
enablers are often girls and women who unknowingly believe their safety relies on obeying rules that a society made by men has created for them, rules of behavior and clothing, of outward appearances. We teach each other how to behave. And I just think that's brilliant. It also helps answer this question you're telling me people ask you, like, well, why didn't you get out sooner? They don't understand what it's like to live in a closed system.
Hmm.
You're breathing the same air and you see those people over there having a different life, but you can't get there. So talk about that a little bit, the complicity, and I feel the same thing when I think, how could any woman vote for Donald Trump?
Yeah.
A guy credibly accused of rape, grabs
Yeah.
people by the genitals and brags about it. A philandering pig that any decent male is revolted at. And then, you got evangelical, pious, God-fearing, quote unquote, evangelical women thinking he's God's gift to the country. Talk about that complicity.
It's so complicated because I've met women who have left and have huge regret, like I do, about our complicity, because once you become part of this system, whether you're raised in it or not, you have to support it to survive. And so that entangles you in that. It's what Dr. Janja Lalich calls moral injury.
Yeah.
Um, and it's harder to leave when you do that because now you're part of it. But when I was growing up, a lot of the enforcers were actually the mothers, the ones teaching us young girls what to do and how to dress. It was mostly women.
Yeah.
And some of them were not very nice. They weren't exactly, it's hard to understand the term victim, but they didn't act like victims, some of them. And I know my family, my father was the one who led us into this, but I know some of my friends, their mother was the one who led them into this, and their father wasn't very patriarchal, but the mom wanted him to be. And that's an interesting dynamic that happens too, of women wanting this kind of authoritarian structure and craving that for some reason.
Mm.
And when I left, I joined another church after I left the movement, and I thought it was a safer church. But the women in the church were the ones who really didn't like me speaking up about things.
Yeah.
Um, they would tell me I was biased because of my experience, or, my ideas about gender were just too much for them. And so a lot of times it's women for probably many reasons who are upholding patriarchy. And I think
Mm.
sometimes it's survival, sometimes it's safety and belonging. I really do think it goes back to those basic needs. And if you believe that's what God wants, it's a really powerful draw. Um, I think it's really unfortunate that they're taught that and they believe that, but it happens a lot that women enforce this kind of living.
Yeah, and of course that fits in with a worldwide trend as well in certain weird areas. And I don't want to get morbid here, but that's what you hear from people who are working to try to eradicate, uh, you know, mutilation of girls in cultures in which sexual mutilation is, female circumcision, whatever it's called, is part of the culture. You often find that the person in the community, the old woman who always does the thing, that it's a woman involved and that, she's the one pressing and saying, we're not letting go of this. And you wonder about how that tradition is passed on. But I recognize this in myself in the sense that, and I don't want to change the subject here, but I find that having rejected the patriarchy as a male is one thing. Living differently is a different thing because it's the social way you were raised. You still want to be in charge. You still think that's somehow you like if, and so the sort of misery loves company thing. Again, people, well, why didn't you just walk away? Well, you're walking away from years and years and years and decades of conditioning and
And
and re,
family and friends and
and
your
family and
whole
friends and
church.
reinforced by other women as well. I want to read this passage here. Um, we were talking about the true hierarchy to survive. Um, you're talking to your father here in the letter that he doesn't reply to. And he says, I realize you're not sorry for how you treated me because you believe you did nothing wrong. That somehow chasing your adult daughter down the street and triggering her first panic attacks and keeping her from pursuing her own life was righteous in God's eyes. But I forgive you anyway. I'm not chained down by what happened anymore. I have a lot of anxiety when I see you, and I struggle to know how to talk to you anymore. But that doesn't mean I can't forgive you. Um, you have in your book this passage of how you deal with things, whether people, want to be forgiven or think they've done something wrong. Um, do you know stories of people who, um, I'm talking about how I've changed in your journey and your writing and your editing and you're talking to people and your book has just come out, but I'll be interested to see the male response from what I would call former abusers, people who maybe as young husbands went along with this and realized how wrong they were. Do you find males out there who get it, who were part of this, but themselves were groomed and raised to be this bully and who really do repent and change, not just what they say, but their behavior? Are you running into people who come to you like a confessor and say, I was one of the people you're talking about, and I'm sorry, and
Hmm.
I'm changing the way I am? I will predict that your book will generate some responses like that.
That's interesting. And I don't know that I can say anyone has said that they were a bully or that kind of personality. I think people like my dad, their personality might prohibit them from ever saying stuff like that. I
Yeah,
have spoken to men who are very sympathetic and get very emotional talking with me. Um, I did talk to one homeschool dad who I appreciated him saying, um, this was not okay for this to happen to you, and
yeah.
I need to open my eyes to like the bigger world of homeschooling. Um, but I don't know if I've talked to anyone that I would call former abusers. I don't know if they would talk to me anyways. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
but people can change, as you know, and I hold out hope for. I've met some men when I tell my story of coming out of the evangelical world and how I
mhm.
regret being as harsh as I was with my kids when they were little, in the sense that I'm in charge and here we go, and spanking my sons sometimes. This is the way I was raised. This is what you do. And I had a total about face at a certain point in my life. It wasn't in just one moment. And look back with horror on that. And I'm very angry with myself. And even though a lot of that was my own conditioning, there's a tremendous amount of regret there.
Mhm.
Fortunately, those relationships are good today. Part of the reason they're good is because I apologized and
Yeah.
said I was really wrong. And I don't have any excuses. I don't tell my whole story. Well, I was raised that way. I don't do any of that. I just apologized
Mhm.
and ask for forgiveness. And that actually can go a long way.
Yeah. And I do believe people can change. And I
Yeah.
just personally, no one has talked to me about that. And mostly it's women who are talking to me.
Yeah, I understand. Let me change the subject and get a little political. In today's world, we've got this trad wives, I think, thing called
Yeah.
Ernie, my producer, Ernie Gregg. How does that strike you, especially if they're secular people, sort of recreating an environment which you've escaped in a way, in a non-theological sense, but as a rebellion against contemporary culture? And like, we're just done with it. We're not doing any more online dating. We're sick of the whole scene. We're going to go back and lift a page from 1950s black and white sitcoms and be that person. It isn't exactly to return to patriarchy, but we're here to serve our husbands, take care of our kids. There's a whole movement, and it isn't just evangelical women. What do you think about that?
Yeah. It's very interesting to see this play out. And I feel like it's an evolving situation with different trad wives who've become like celebrities. I did write a piece about this for Newsweek because it seems so similar to what I was told, and it's presented in such a beautiful way. Homemaking and homesteading is presented at this as this ideal way of living. But I've lived that, and I grew up in a community where people made their own bread and ground their own wheat and made their own clothes. It's not an easy life. Um, there's a lot of hardship to that, and a couple things I want to say about it. I think it's deceitful to present it as the only way to live godly. And so what's tricky about trad wives now is they're pulling people in through that beautiful aesthetic. And then a lot of times on the back end, they're really Mormons or evangelicals who are spreading ideas about women's agency or lack of agency. And that's dangerous, in my
Yeah,
opinion. The other side of that is the children involved in these situations is what's truly concerning to me, because what are they being told as they're growing up? What are they being isolated from? Are they being used for social media for profit? That's an issue. Um, are they being neglected? Are they being cared for in the way they deserve? And so it's really complicated. And the trad wife trend is tricky because some of it's satire, some of it's very much real, and it's hard to tell the difference sometimes.
well, and it gets into even a whole thing called stay-at-home girlfriends.
Right. Yeah, I've
I mean,
heard
it's
that.
it's it's not that's not a traditional marriage. This is somebody
Right.
living just with a guy, but she stays home, and basically she's into personal grooming and
Hmm.
does a lot of exercise and shopping, and but be there when her guy comes back whenever he wants her.
Yeah, and I think part of this is also like economic anxiety. I think we live in a time where people my age and especially Gen Z coming up, there's a lot of anxiety about economic stability. And so I think this is like a one channel for that anxiety to go is like, oh, if I could just be with somebody who's wealthy and can provide for me, then I can live this laid back lifestyle. So
Yeah,
I think that's part of it too.
yeah. So tell us about the article you wrote for Newsweek on it. Go into that a little more. What'd you say?
Yeah, I just said it. I think they titled it something like "It's hauntingly familiar," because I was a stay-at-home daughter raised to be a trad wife,
Yeah,
and I broke down a couple videos from social media of one prominent trad wife and how she was telling young girls to rethink college. And maybe you don't need that. Maybe you just should just get married and that could be your calling. And
yeah,
it's presented in this really nice framework, but it's such a dangerous message because it's layered on top of this other video telling them once you get married, you have to submit to that man. And this is what that looks like. And for me, it's one thing to choose to be a stay-at-home wife or mom. That's one thing. That's totally fine. It's another thing to give up your agency and say, I'm not going to make decisions for myself. I'm going to give all of that decision-making power to somebody else.
Hmm.
Because once you do that, there's no taking that back in an easy
Yeah,
way. It's not like a back and forth situation.
yeah,
So I think it's really misleading to tell girls that that's a good way to live when I don't think it's good for anyone to give up their own decision-making power.
yeah. Yeah, there's a passage in your book that I wrote a little note to myself, use in my book as a quote, because I was reading it and it jumped out. I'm writing on something now that I won't get into, but in any case, one of the things in it is trying to explain why, after years after leaving the evangelical community, my wife and I, still sometimes would go to church. In our case, we went to a Greek Orthodox church, and trying to explain why that happened. And I, this quote jumped out at me. Oh, well, it's not a quote in your book, it's yours. It'll be a quote in my book. For a long time after leaving the Christian patriarchy movement, I still went to church wanting to hold on to a divinity that loves me while throwing away all that has harmed me. But the very experience of being inside a church building, interacting with people who seemed to have no problems with church and no questions about God, became too much for me. I felt on edge, tired of hiding in the bathroom during the prayers or dodging conversations about my extended family. It's that's like a page ripped from the headlines of my own life. I mean, you really summed it up and very, very well. And I had exactly the same experience. I don't go to church anymore, and nor does my wife Jeannie. We just finally were done with the whole thing. And the added pressure for us was, even after we were on our way out, it was like, well, shouldn't we do something? Don't the kids need some sort of religious something? So there was that too.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I just thought you summed it up so well there on page, whatever this is, 197. Just want to talk a little bit about that kind of residual echo of that kind of need for formal relationship with some sort of religious community, and just how that kind of transcends any intellectual desire. Or I'll put it this way, talking too much, but I've just got to tell you this. Um, People sometimes say, I call myself an atheist at this point in my life, but I say I'm an atheist who prays. And someone said to me, actually, it was one of the new atheist movement people, uh, asked me, why do you still do that? And I said, because that's the way my mom raised me. You got a problem with that? And that's the honest answer. We want to find big answers, like because I believe this, or I want to seeking for meaning. But there's so much in our lives that has to do with our conditioning. We should just face it. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like an echo in the background. You can't walk away from it. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah. And I think that's partly, what I'm trying to say with the book is like we can't escape what's happened to us or what we've done. Like we have to face the past and then somehow incorporate that into our present life. And I mean, after I left my family, I still really wanted to be part of a church. And I tried for years. Um, and I wanted to tell that story because so many times people will say, well, you left church because you were hurt. And I I wanted to show them I gave the church so many chances.
Sure.
Um, because it really was a big part of my life and my faith was a big part of my life. And even though it isn't anymore, that's still part of who I am because
Yeah.
that was the way I was raised and that was my understanding of the universe. And that
Yeah.
has shifted quite a bit, but I don't think there's ever completely losing the things we learned when we were, before we can even remember.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things you allude to in another section of the book when you talk about some fertility issues is you say, on my worst days, this is on page 213, I punish myself with the thought that my experiences with infertility is part of my curse for leaving the world a patriarchy. I defied God's plan for my body, which was to have as many children as possible. And because of that, I don't deserve to be a mother. Real mothers wouldn't use contraceptives. I imagine my belly as a dark, empty nothing. I love your writing. I hear the words of Kevin Swanson saying that the birth control pill makes your womb into a graveyard for dead babies. That's a powerful story. And I'm glad at the end of the book you share that kind of very personal part of your life in terms of fertility issues, um, and use that as an example of the kind of residual echo that you bring with you into the rest of your life. And all I can tell you is you're not alone again in this, because I don't have fertility issues. I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. and we have plenty of children and all the rest of that. And yet I have exactly the same impulse about so many things in my life
Hmm.
that you're just saying, you almost hear the voice in the background saying, what did you think was going to happen? You walked away from whatever and fill in the blank. So
Yeah.
for you, it was a fertility thing. For me, it's been many other things. Um, it's a very common experience, I think, for people who leave a faith background. There, you can leave it, but it doesn't exactly leave you. And it's a real psychological burden in a way.
Yeah. Especially when there was shame involved, there was, for me growing up, any woman who didn't have children, there was a shame about that. And so, I think embodied that, or I internalized it, this shame. And yeah, in my head, I know that's not true. All those things that my pastor said about women, but then in my body, you know, I can't help but feel like that's part of the reason I have these issues. But I don't believe that. And it's just like this struggle, this battle to resist those old voices and make something new for myself.
Yeah, and you talk about that new thing, page 218 here. You say, my world may be small, but I have the fire of love in my home. I may be estranged from some of my family, but not all, not even most. I have nieces and nephews whom I love. I have my work, and before it can be said that I am a working woman who just doesn't want kids enough, let me say that my work editing books and volunteering for spiritual abuse survivors has nurtured me, and I believe that it can nurture others too. And I love that because, in a way, it's a wonderful rebuke to me in the sense that I have been trying to work on something explaining why, as a male raised in a patriarchal environment, we're sort of the flip side of each other and we've come to the same place in our lives. Why I've been doing intensive childcare for the last 15 years for my three youngest grandchildren who live across the street. I'm the guy that picks them up from school. I cook for them every day. Before I came to this podcast here, I looked in the mirror to make sure I'd gotten pesto out of my teeth from having picked fresh pesto in my garden. I do the cooking and I'm a sort of stay-at-home mom, grandfather. I I blog about this, I put things online about this and had many, many views. And what's wonderful is to read something in your book that comes from a totally different position, um, or past. And yet, when you say, my world may be small, but I have the fire of love in my home. I may be estranged from some of my family, but not all, not even most. I love the way you have focused on the human connection at the end of the story, which for me is what it's all about.
Mhm.
And it's a good reminder to me when I use the word rebuke that there are many paths to this enlightenment.
Yeah.
And you provided me with a really great example of that I will use. So, my highest compliment to you is I will shamelessly plagiarize your book, but I'll put it in the footnotes who wrote it.
Okay. Thank you.
I won't just steal straight out. But
Okay.
anyway, I told you before, I really like you. And I love this
Thank you.
aspect of you that you finish your book by telling the most personal anecdotal stories about your life and your own fertility issues. In the same way that I go to my most personal stories about getting Jeannie pregnant when we're 17 and 18. It's a very different path, but you and I have drawn the same conclusion
Hmm.
about what's important in life.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like when you go through the fires of life, you learn what's really important. And I learned in my family of origin that doctrine was more important than relationship. And I felt and I could witness how harmful that was. And so I never want to live by that philosophy ever again. And so to me, relationship is higher than doctrine or religion.
Before I let you go, I just want to again tell everybody that we're making this part of our book club here coming up, and we're doing it on purpose because it's a wonderful book. It's really good. And you're such a great writer, and I think you're going to write a lot of books and do extremely well as a writer. Um, but I just want to ask one bookkeeping, not bookkeeping, but what do you call it? Sort of boilerplate question. you're in your bio, it says you're an editor, and you spoke of editing a minute ago and reminded me that I wanted to start this by asking you, but never too late. Tell me a little bit about this whole editing gig of yours. What do you edit? You write, you wrote this piece for Newsweek. I know you do other things. Speak about the editing and how you got there and what you're doing. What sort of things do you edit?
Yeah, so a couple things. My day job is I am a book editor for a publishing company, and so I can work remotely from my home.
Well, what company are you an editor for?
Oh, I don't like to share that just because I try to keep that part of my life pretty private because I like to have some parts that aren't quite public.
Hey, I love that. I mean, you're telling us about your fertility issues and your family, but you won't tell us the company you work for. But it's got to be a good one because you're a sensible person. But I just want to signal everybody that Cait is not a careerist. You know, when people work for fancy companies, they say what they work for. Nope, she's keeping that private, but she will tell you about her fertility cycles and her history with taking the pill. But never mind. Just saying, just mentioning that.
Well, just because book publishing is kind of a weird world, and I
Yeah.
use a different last name for my writing than I do for my editing. And so
Oh
I'd
my
like to
goodness.
keep
And
it
which is the
separate.
real one?
The editing. So West is actually my grandmother's maiden name.
I
And that
love
was
it.
intentional because I wanted a matriarchal name.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I do that every day. I get to read. It's a lot of fiction, which is really good for my brain to
Yeah.
take breaks from the other stuff I do. And then
And
I
how long have you
also
been doing that?
since I graduated college in 2018.
That's great.
So yeah,
So
I love it.
the editing job came straight out of that experience. So you went off and applied and got a job.
Well, I worked internships and temp jobs and freelance for a while before I could get a full-time position. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on all that. Let me get to something here I wanted to finish with. It's I actually had three or four more things, but I'll leave it at this because we're running out of time here. Being free from the oppression of Christian patriarchy has not meant that I am unaffected by my past or immune to societal patriarchy. Every day I am reminded of my limitations. I am impacted by past trauma shaped by my experiences. And again, I don't want to get too topical here, but it must be tough seeing that our culture wars, it's not coincidental that every time Donald Trump or his sidekick, vice presidential candidate, or for that matter, Elon Musk or any of these people in the manosphere, their whole stick always revolves finally in the end. It's like women have done something wrong. They're either not having enough babies or they're demanding diversity and equity and inclusion, and that's those blasted women again. I want you to say something. How is it that the patriarchal paradigm of weird evangelical groups is now being echoed in Silicon Valley by billionaires? And one whole political party seems to have been groomed in this world and bought in some degree, to your father's theology, if I can put it that way. I mean, what the hell's going on here? This is modern America. This is 2024. And it sure doesn't feel like it when our culture wars are being fought again along lines that feel like they're being pulled out of the 12th century when it comes to women. What's going on?
I wish I could give a definite answer. I think a lot of things are going on. I don't think it's something that we can really boil down into one answer. I think a lot of it is authoritarianism. So I think the Republican Party has shifted towards authoritarianism. That's something that's similar to what my dad's personality is. And so I think authoritarianism and patriarchy and colonialism are all tied together. Um, in terms of like the manosphere, not all of that's religious. Sometimes it's just men who are socialized to think that they should be at the top of society are not feeling that they are getting what they deserve, and then they get sucked into this radicalization through the internet.
Yeah,
And I think those things overlap because they have similar goals. And so I
yeah,
think there's a lot of motivations going on, but when they combine forces, it can be more powerful in our culture. And so I'm not an expert on that. That's just things I've observed. But I do know in the political world, people like my dad, the leaders I grew up with, this what's happening now is what they wanted to happen. And so we are seeing things like you said, Project 2025, that's coming straight from the people I grew up with, the Heritage Foundation, HSLDA. It's what they've been working for decades. And so whether or not everyone in the Republican Party follows those organizations, they're being influenced by them and latching onto them because of the power. And so, yeah, it's very complex. It's very disappointing. But I also want to say I have a lot of hope that people are talking about it and aren't
Yeah.
apathetic. And I think a lot of people do really care. The more and more I travel and talk to people, I'm finding a lot of hope because I can get really despairing about this kind of thing, but I'm feeling hopeful about it.
Yeah, and it's so funny that the Heritage Foundation of all people, and all of which involves people that I know personally or knew of or was around in the day when they were getting going, and my father influenced them greatly, and our family was very powerful in those groups. And we knew all those Republican presidents and hung out with everybody, blah, blah, blah. But what I think a lot of people don't understand is when they read that the leader of the Heritage Foundation is also a member of Opus Dei, and that was founded by in the time of Francisco Franco in Spain to support his
Yeah.
vision of the world, which was not just authoritarian but straight out fascist.
Hmm.
And none of these guys are apologizing for that. They're just signing on.
Yeah.
That fits in very well with the view that I think someone like some of our billionaire class have in the tech industry of,
Hmm.
their real objection to women is the same as their objection to the government or any regulation whatsoever. And that is, I know best. I'm a billionaire. Don't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Don't get in my way. So it's these are fellow travelers. They're coming from a different place. But the problem is when you put them all together and the reach they have
Hmm.
an inordinate amount of power and money.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Okay,
overwhelming.
this has been a really good discussion. I want to finish up by asking you if there's something you'd like to say that I didn't get to. Anything you want to add, please go anywhere you want. Let's give you the final word here, and then I'll close this out.
Um, I don't know. I guess I often like to close out by saying to whoever's listening that your story matters and you matter no matter what other people in your life have told you.
Mm.
I didn't believe that for myself for a long time, and so I want people to know that that's true. And yeah, I'm still doing this kind of work. You can find me on a lot of social media. Cait West writes. I also have a Substack newsletter, and I've been doing some traveling and some events. So, especially the next couple months, it'll be mostly in the Midwest. So, if you want to come meet me and we could do an event, yeah, check out my website.
And I'll just add that Ernie Gregg, our producer, will post links to anything you want him to link to.
Okay.
I have a question for you I'll ask here. And the first thing to say is, please, when I click off and say, we're done here, don't you click off. Stay on and talk with Ernie so he can make sure to get everything he needs from you
Okay.
to promote the hell out of your book. I'm going to finish by saying again, it's Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy, and Cait West is the author, and there she is. And we're going to have her as a part of our book club. Um, and that said, the only thing I would add here is that I'm hoping that if you have some people who are on either similar or very different journeys, but that as an editor for a start, writers that you know, or other people with stories to tell that need to be heard, please let Ernie know, because we found you through one of our guests. And some of our best guests come to us because a guest is kind enough to pass on two or three names and say, you really ought to talk to her or to him or to them
Mhm.
or whatever. So please let us know if there's any way you know who has a story to tell that needs to be heard or a book that should be promoted, because we are happy to do that, and that's what we're here for.
Okay. Sounds good.
Hey, and again, I like you so much. I got to know you through your book, and I love the book, and I am so admiring of you, and you've taught me something. And
Oh,
I'm going to speak a little differently about some of these issues because of the story you've told. So thank you very much.
oh, thank you. And I'm looking forward to your new book too.
Thank you. Well, I'll get it to you. To give Ernie your personal information, and
Okay.
so that I can stay in touch with you, because and please get back to me through Ernie or directly to me if there's anything I can do for you or more we can do for your book or for you personally, because
Thank
I
you.
feel really connected to your story and I would do anything I could to help out.
Oh, thank you. It really means a lot. Thank
Well, I
you.
mean it. So take care of yourself.
You too.
Cait, I love your book.